Humanity's last stand against galactic tyranny. The skies above Fort Aegis burned with the colors of annihilation. Green lances of charged plasma tore through the night, their light carving the clouds into jagged scars, while kinetic bombardments slammed into the mountains beyond the walls, shaking the ground like the heartbeat of some ancient beast. Every impact sent showers of rock and metal cascading down the ridges, some pieces big enough to crush entire squads. In the command bastion, Commander Auric Vale watched the tactical holomap with the cold focus of a man who had no illusions left. The Terrassan Empire's fleet-filled orbit, a glittering serpent coiled around Earth's last military fortress. Hundreds of dropships were already in atmosphere, their black hulls glinting with weapon ports, their descent paths lighting the holomap like streaks of falling meteors. Auric knew what they wanted. Not just the base, but the surrender of the species it sheltered. And they weren't going to get it. Outside, the defensive lines stretched across the broken plateau like the ribs of some fallen titan. Hardened bunkers, railgun nests, and trenches reinforced with the jagged remains of destroyed vehicles. Soldiers of the United Earth Guard moved through the darkness between flashes of enemy fire, faces pale but determined. Most wore armor scavenged from battles long lost, patched together with whatever materials could be found. The fortress had been under siege for 56 days, cut off from supply lines, running on rations and recycled air. Ammunition was rationed to the last bullet, power cells recharged in shifts to keep the railguns operational. Still, morale held. Not because they believed they could win, but because they knew what would happen if they lost. Everyone in Fort Aegis had seen the Terrassans work, worlds stripped of resources, their people herded into labor pits until nothing remained but dust and bones. In the enemy flagship orbiting high above, Warlord Sarek of the Terrassan Empire observed the battle from the comfort of his throne-like command chair. Tall and encased in armor grown from living metals, Sarek regarded the humans not as an enemy, but as a pest infestation requiring extermination. Yet he could not deny the irritation they had caused him. This fortress should have fallen weeks ago. Every other human redoubt had been smashed in a matter of days, their defenders broken or scattered. But Fort Aegis, it bled his soldiers for every meter they took. "They will break," his adjutant hissed from behind a visor of chitin and steel. "They always break." Sarek said nothing. In his long campaigns, he had learned that the most dangerous prey was not the one that attacked recklessly, but the one that fought with precision and patience. These humans were not flailing. They were choosing where to bleed him, and that was unsettling. On the walls, Auric Vale moved among his people, speaking briefly to each squad. He didn't offer false hope. They were too smart for that. But he reminded them that every hour they held the line was another hour for something bigger than themselves. Somewhere out there, human survivors were hiding, regrouping, finding ways to escape the Empire's net. The Terrassans thought this was the last of humanity, but Auric knew better. "When they break through," he told his second-in-command, Captain Mara Lorne, "we take as many as we can with us. No retreat, no surrender." Mara simply nodded. They had already burned the evacuation plans. The first breach came just before dawn. A Terrassan heavy lander, shielded by a wall of sacrificial drones, plowed straight into the outer wall's Gate 3. The impact shattered the gates and threw debris the size of tanks into the courtyard. Terrassan warriors, tall and blade-limbed, surged through the smoke. Railguns roared, cutting down the first wave, but more poured in, their armor shimmering as it deflected glancing hits. The fighting was close now. Knives, shotguns, bare hands when ammunition ran out. Auric was in the thick of it, his sidearm barking until it clicked empty, then swinging the butt into an alien's visor before drawing his combat knife. Around him, soldiers fought with a desperation born of knowing there was nowhere to run. From orbit, Sarek watched the breach unfold and permitted himself a thin smile. The humans were fierce, but ferocity would not save them from numbers. He gave the I order to deploy the juggernauts, towering siege walkers bristling with cannons and missile pods. As the massive machines descended through the smoke, their footfalls shook the ground. Arik saw them and knew the walls would not hold much longer. He opened a secure channel to Mara. "Signal the Black Protocol," he said. There was a pause. "Sir, that's all of it." "I know," Arik replied. The Black Protocol was not a retreat plan. It was the last card humanity could play. A system of buried charges, hacked orbital satellites, and weaponized reactors designed to detonate in sequence, turning Fort Aegis into a death trap for every Tyranny in 100 kilometers. It was an ending, but it was theirs to choose. Fort Aegis hadn't been built as a fortress. Once it had been a research and logistics hub at the edge of the Boreas Plateau, supporting mining colonies scattered across the northern hemisphere of Earth's last unoccupied continent. It only became a citadel after the First Dominion War, when the Terrassans swept through the frontier systems and broke every human fleet that tried to stop them. The United Earth Directorate ordered every surviving outpost to harden its defenses, but there was no illusion that this would stop the Empire, only slow it. Arik Vale had been a fleet officer then, watching from orbit as planetary capitals fell in days, their governments surrendering in exchange for promises that were broken before the ink dried. He'd seen the aftermath on Mistral Prime, the black, pits where cities had been, the smoke rising for weeks, the silence on the comm channels. That was when he swore he would never let Earth suffer the same fate. The path to Fort Aegis's final stand began with betrayal. 2 years before the siege, the Directorate signed what was supposed to be a non-aggression pact with the Terrassan Empire. In exchange for ceding 12 colonies and dismantling most of the fleet, the Empire promised to recognize Earth's sovereignty. Many called it a victory for peace. Arik called it a death sentence on a delay. He was right. Within months, Tyranny observers began arriving on Earth, followed by demands for access to resource processing facilities. Then came the assassinations. Governors, scientists, military officers, always replaced by someone more compliant. By the time the Directorate realized they had signed away their survival, the Empire's forces were already in orbit. That was when Arik and Captain Mara Lorne, along with a handful of others, enacted the Black Protocol. It wasn't an official plan. It didn't exist in any database. The protocol was a blueprint Arik had been refining since the First War, a series of interlinked defensive and offensive measures designed not to win a battle, but to deny the enemy the fruits of victory. Fort Aegis was chosen for its location, a plateau with limited approaches, natural choke points, and deep bedrock capable of hiding what they were building. Under the cover of routine expansion, the garrison constructed underground vaults lined with explosives, fusion reactor cores modified for overload, and control nodes to tie it all together. On the surface, they reinforced bunkers and deployed decoy artillery, enough to draw attention, but not enough to reveal the real danger. Recruitment for the garrison was selective. Soldiers were brought in from units that had suffered under Tyranny rule, people who had seen firsthand what happened when humanity surrendered. They were told the truth. If Fort Aegis fell, it would take as many of the enemy with it as possible. Not all accepted. Some walked away. But those who stayed trained for the reality that their fight would likely end here. The protocol demanded absolute secrecy. Even the Directorate didn't know. Arik knew that political leaders, desperate, frightened, might try to trade the protocol away in a last-minute bargain. He couldn't allow that. Meanwhile, intelligence reports painted a grim picture. The Terrassans were massing fleets beyond the neutral zone, ignoring the treaty they had signed. Smaller human colonies that hadn't been ceded were absorbed into the Empire without resistance. And then came the final insult. the blockade of Earth's orbital space under the pretense of joint security patrols. It was a noose, and everyone inside Fort Aegis knew it was tightening. The decision to activate the protocol wasn't made in a council room. It happened in a dim-lit briefing chamber with only Auric, Mara, and the core staff. "When they come," Auric had said, "we don't just hold the line. We make this the place they regret." The siege began the day the Tyrasans launched a simultaneous strike on every human defensive installation worldwide. In less than 72 hours, Fort Aegis was the only major military site still holding out. Auric's forces cut power to all civilian sectors within 50 kilometers, drawing the enemy toward the fortress while evacuation shuttles slipped out under the cover of storms and jamming fields. Every hour they held gave those shuttles more time to get survivors to hidden safe zones. Auric knew the Tyrasans would figure out the pattern eventually, but by then it would be too late. The protocol wasn't about saving Fort Aegis. It was about making the cost of taking it so high that the Empire would think twice before tightening its grip elsewhere. As the weeks of siege wore on, the Tyrasans threw everything they had at the plateau: artillery barrages from orbit, armored divisions crawling up the mountain passes, airstrikes that turned the surrounding forests to ash. But the fortress held. The enemy never saw the hidden mines embedded in the approaches, the camouflaged missile nests buried under rubble, the sudden avalanches triggered by charges planted months earlier. Every counterattack was precise, every shot accounted for. To the Tyrasans, it must have seemed like desperation. In truth, it was calculation. Every move designed to funnel them toward the killing ground that would be the Black Protocol's final act. The Juggernauts reached the inner wall by midday. Each was a walking fortress of alloyed bone metal, bristling with siege cannons and rotary plasma lances. Their steps cracked the stone foundations beneath them. Their weapons chewed through bunkers in seconds. Auric Vale stood at the northern parapet, watching the machines advance, and knew the moment had come. "Mara," he said into his comm. "We're out of time." Her voice came back steady. "Understood. Black Protocol. Full cascade." Across the fortress, concealed operators turned keys in armored panels, releasing the locks on systems buried deep below. Warning klaxons wailed, but not for evacuation, for readiness. Every man and woman in Fort Aegis had known from the start what this meant. They took their final positions without hesitation. The Tyrasan ground forces surged through the breached gates, confident the end was at hand. They didn't see the changes at first, the way the railgun fire shifted, targeting not troops but the Juggernaut stabilizers, the way the outer walls collapsed inward at precise points, channeling them into narrow kill zones. From orbit, Warlord Sarek leaned forward, sensing something was wrong. The humans were giving ground too easily now, falling back in clean lines instead of breaking. "Pull back the walkers," he ordered. But the command never reached them. Communications were already compromised, not by jamming, but by a sudden flood of false priority signals bouncing between their own units. The humans were inside their net. The first detonation came from beneath the central courtyard. It wasn't an explosion in the traditional sense, but the violent breach of a reactor core set to overload. A column of blinding light erupted skyward, vaporizing everything within 100 meters, Tyrasan and human alike, and frying the sensors of every nearby unit. Before the shockwave had even faded, secondary charges planted in the support pylons of the plateau went off in sequence. Massive slabs of rock sheared away, taking entire columns of Tyrasan infantry with them into the abyss below. In the chaos, concealed missile silos within the inner wall launched their payloads straight into the underbellies of the Juggernauts, where their armor was weakest. One by one, the giants collapsed, burning from the inside out. From the command bastion, Auric watched the carefully planned destruction unfold. Every blast, every collapse, every triggered avalanche was part of the design. The Black Protocol wasn't a single weapon. It was a symphony of annihilation, each note timed to break the Tyranny assault at its peak momentum. And it was working. For the first time in the siege, the enemy was retreating, scrambling to pull back from the death trap they'd walked into. But there would be no escape. The final stage of the protocol was already in motion, the orbital phase. Months ago, human infiltration teams had seeded the near orbit with hacked Tyranny satellites and decommissioned weapons platforms, their controls buried in encrypted ghost programs. Now those systems woke, targeting the retreating fleet above. From the clouds, thin, needle-bright beams lanced upward, punching through capital ships like they were paper. On the Tyranny flagship, alarms screamed as Sarek's bridge crew reported catastrophic losses. Dozens of ships were gone in minutes, more crippled. The warlord's composure cracked for the first time, his voice a hiss of disbelief. "They were dying," he snarled. "How can the dying strike like this?" The answer came from Mara Lorne's voice, transmitted across every Tyranny frequency. "Because we chose the ground we die on." Her words were followed by the last detonation, the heart of Fort Aegis itself. The central fusion plant, modified into a weapon of last resort, tore itself apart in a controlled implosion that became an expanding sphere of plasma and debris. Everything within its radius, fortress, Tyranny ground forces, and the last defenders of humanity's stronghold vanished in a white-hot bloom. The blast gutted the Tyranny command structure in the sector. With their flagship crippled, and their invasion force shattered, the Empire withdrew, not out of mercy, but out of necessity. They had learned something they could never forget. Even with their backs to the wall, humanity would not kneel. Survivors from evacuation shuttles and hidden redoubts spread the story across the galaxy of how a single fortress, outnumbered 100 to 1, had held for nearly 2 months and chosen its own end rather than surrender. In neutral ports and outlaw stations, the tale grew into legend, and the name Fort Aegis became a rallying cry for every world still under Tyranny rule. Far from the ashes of the plateau, in a hidden valley shielded by the electromagnetic storms of an uncharted world, Auric Vale opened his eyes in a dim medical bay. Against all odds, he had been dragged from the brink by a medevac team that had slipped through the chaos in the final minutes. Around him were others, battered, burned, but alive. Mara was there too, leaning on a crutch, her eyes fierce despite her exhaustion. "We're not done," she told him. "We've shown them what it costs. Now we make them pay it again and again." Auric nodded slowly. The last stand was over, but the war for humanity's future, was only just beginning.